Um, what I'm going to talk about is housing, because because obviously we're in the middle of a housing crisis, and it kind of begs to be talked about. And what I really want to talk about is what happens to social housing, broadly conceived, when its traditional, for want of a better word, sources of funding are no longer considered politically possible, for various, usually ideological reasons. I don't necessarily think I will be indulging in conspiracy theories or allegations of a conscious plan, but I don't think anyone would seriously dispute that from the late 1970s onwards there has been a decisive shift in power towards the rich. I don't think this is under any serious dispute. And that during this time, things like local democracy, not even democracy in general, have atrophied, and that what social projects have survived have had to adapt to the new circumstances. So it's not as if sort of suddenly in 1979 everyone woke up and said we're not going to do social housing anymore. Not even that, and everyone woke up in 1997 and said we're not going to do social housing anymore. It does still occur in certain ways, although in very, very different ways. But during this, so certain things have happened, and for those of you that haven't read it, there was one essay which I would recommend you all do read, because it's the clearest and best piece of writing on the subject, which is an essay on housing called Where Shall We Live? By James Meek in the London Review of Books, which was in, I think, the issue of the first week of January. Anyway, if you Google James Meek housing, you'll find it at the top.
Can you speak nearer the microphone?
I suppose I could. Is that any better? There's seats here, by the way, if you want to come closer. Like, there's one over there and one over there. Usually I don't speak with microphones at all. Usually I just bellow. I usually just hector. During the last 30 years, we've seen certain things have happened in housing in particular. First of all, the right to buy council housing was brought in. Something which was kind of consciously done, really, as a way of making a certain amount of working class people vote Conservative, quite consciously. Again, this is not conspiracy. This is, something that's very, very well attested. Lots of people have said this who were in the Conservative Party and the cabinet. This was a strategy. This is a way of making working class people vote Tory. And in and of itself, a lot of people kind of came quickly to accept right to buy. Well, essentially, for those who don't know, that people who lived in council housing, who lived in housing built and owned by the local democratic authority, were allowed to buy it at a discount. And in so doing, this created this kind of new group of owner-occupiers who had previously been in the working class. And it had two major effects. One of which is that it took very, very quickly the best public housing out of public ownership. Meaning that immediately a kind of huge amount of public assets became private. The people who bought these could, if they were, in particular areas of London, get very, very rich. Anyone that bought their council flat in Islington in 1980 is now probably owns an island somewhere. You could get spectacularly rich off this. Although in many cases people probably didn't. You would buy it and then you would run out of money because lots of people lost their jobs. You would get negative equity, or something would happen that would basically mean that you would then sell it on to a private landlord. And now a huge proportion of flats and houses that were bought in right to buy are owned by private landlords. So it kind of created this new class of quite exploitative private landlords. And you have this strange paradox where, for instance, in the block where I live in Woolwich, you will have people living next door to each other in exactly the same flat who'll be paying wildly different amounts. My neighbour pays half the rent that I do because I'm renting ex-council flat from a private landlord, to use an obvious example. And as well as the removal of this stuff from the public sphere, the money raised in Right to Buy did not go to councils. It went straight to the Treasury. So it went straight to central government, who then basically, spent it on tax cuts for the rich. The other thing that happened is also at the same time, council housing stopped being built. So people who kind of want a slightly better version of Right to Buy often sort of say, if we had the receipts from it and we could build new stuff to replace it, then it could have been less bad. Regardless, thanks to devolution, some parts of the country are actually trying to limit this or even abolish it. The Welsh Assembly has abolished Right to Buy in Wales. You cannot buy your council flat in Wales. The Scottish Parliament is also, in the process of trying to abolish it. And why? I think largely because of the fact that as this has happened, it's severely limited housing for those that can't afford, housing on the open market, which is a lot of people. During that time, the supply of low-income housing has been restricted, that people have, that house prices have expanded to an absurd extent, to a ludicrous extent. So if you look at the graphs on this, the amount by which they've increased beyond inflation and beyond wages is just exponential. It's insane. So you have now 5 million people on the social housing waiting list. And virtually no social housing is getting built. Quite a lot of social housing, on the other hand, is getting demolished and replaced with private housing. So, put very, very bluntly, there's a profound crisis happening. And the background to that, to what I'm going to talk about really is that. And that's why I've got an extended preamble, because this, I think, has to be borne in mind if we're talking about cities in any way, shape or form. Most of my examples are not from London, although London is probably the worst of it. All the photographs are by me, which is why they're mostly terrible. The reason why I want to start with this is because this is this scheme here is the kind of last council housing scheme on any kind of large scale. The last big estate, basically. The last estate to be funded and kind of constructed and kind of owned entirely by a local authority. The local authorities were allowed to borrow to build this stuff. People often suggest that because they were borrowing it, this means that this stuff never paid for itself, which is actually a bit of a myth, that actually the receipts from council housing meant this stuff actually did end up paying for itself. But anyway, you had to borrow to do it. You had to borrow quite a lot of capital to do it. But it was publicly owned, publicly controlled, etc., etc. But what's interesting about this one is that it was an attempt to kind of break with the way council housing had been built up to that date. It was begun in 1969 and finished, and kind of stopped unfinished in 1981, when the kind of funding for council housing was completely cut by central government. Although it was kind of probably about 90% finished at the end, so it feels quite complete when you walk around it. It's the Biker estate in Newcastle, just east of the city centre of Newcastle upon Tyne. It was designed by the Swedish architect Anglo-Swedish architect Ralph Erskine, and the architect set up his office. Ralph Erskine and Vernon Gracie set up their office on the site of an area that was supposed to be redeveloped. So, like lots of the schemes we've been talking about, places like the Haygate estate, this is an area that was subject to some kind of slum clearance, as it was then called. Lots of things kind of had more blunt names back in the old days. Now we would call it something much more euphemistic. So it was an area of Tyneside flats, as they're known, which are basically look like terraced houses but are actually flats. And there's quite a lot of them in Newcastle upon Tyne and Gateshead and so forth, Jarrow. Which had over time become quite dilapidated. They didn't have inside toilets, they didn't have central heating. And what you did with this in the 1950s and 60s was demolish the lot and then build some towers. So although it was done by a democratically controlled local authority, which you could vote in or vote out, which you could stand for election in, which had a kind of, this is a point when turnouts in these elections were far, far higher than they are now. That despite the fact that the bodies doing it were democratically controlled, there was very, very little democratic control of space when this stuff was and very little sense that you would bother consulting the people there. Often you'd be presented with a straight choice. Do you want a house in a new town, or do you want a tower where you live now? And a lot of people chose the house in the new town. So it was, you know, in the parlance, top down. Byker was supposed to be much the same thing in terms of that this area would be demolished and a completely new estate would be built with much more public space, with a connection to the new metro system, which was then being built in Newcastle upon Tyne, and it has a metro station next to it. That would be, you know, have bigger flats with inside toilets and central heating and all mod cons. But rather than kind of doing it in one stroke, the architects kind of, you know, would sort of demolish a little bit, then build a little bit, and then kind of work out with people, okay, what do you like about this? What works here? What doesn't work? What would you like in the next part? And so forth. And it kind of went on like this, incrementally. There was no master plan that was carried out. They didn't get in, you know, Allies and Morrison or whoever, or BDP to say, what's this place going to look like? You know, the architects were on site every day talking to people and, you know, gradually coming up with something that have developed fairly organically. It was still quite heavily criticised at the time for the fact that it was still slum clearance, for the fact that still, rather than renovating these houses, they were being demolished. So although there were huge efforts to keep the people that were living there, a lot of them still didn't. A lot of people who'd been moved out by the council didn't come back. But nonetheless, I think it's still a small majority of people actually did come back to live in the new estate, so which is much, much higher than was usually the case. And they would often move to particular, you know, people would be housed with their neighbours and so forth. So there was a, you know, large degree of what now gets called consultation. Although consultation is usually a rather sort of box-ticking thing, but a consultation really comes from the 70s. Consultation comes from people in the 70s saying, we do not want plans to be imposed upon us, we want to take part in this in a democratic process. And it sort of goes from there. It shouldn't be about people ticking boxes on coffee mornings. This estate was Grade 2 style listed about 7-8 years ago, and was, like lots of estates at its time, had become fairly run down, although it was still popular with residents. And it was kind of offered a choice a few years ago, about 2 years ago. One of the policies of the Labour government that was, you know, in power from 97 to 2010 was that there would be money for the repairs of council housing with certain provisos. One of which was that it was preferred that in most cases the councils would transfer to housing associations, so that these would no longer be controlled by these public bodies, but would be controlled by housing associations. And I'll get on to housing associations in a bit, because they're usually the kind of good guys in the bad things, as it were. They're the sort of force of offsetting in a way. You know, many property development schemes that are kind of ruthless and terrifying will have like a little bit of housing association stuff, and to go, look, we're not completely evil. So it was made quite clear that there was not money for this to be run as council housing anymore. That if the tenants voted to stay with the council, they would not get any cash, so that would not get renovated. And these ballots kind of took place all over the country in the late 90s and 2000s. In some cases people voted for transfer to housing associations, in some cases they voted against. Round here maybe they voted against. But they were offered, you know, three choices: housing association and you get some money, council and you get some money, and community land trust and you may get some money. And that's quite interesting, that there was a kind of third option that they were given. Community land trusts are a kind of American import, which, unlike most American imports, isn't insanely right-wing. Which basically, you know, would involves the area being kind of legally owned by the people that live there. And that they would then have a sort of democratically elected body which would kind of run the place. So it's still kind of quasi-public, and there would be kind of certain kind of rules of the land of kind of, that you wouldn't be allowed to sell it at profit, that you would have to have low-income housing on it, and so forth. One of those strange things in which the US is actually slightly more left-wing than we are. And there's been kind of sporadic attempts at bringing this in the last couple of years, strangely enough, under an insanely right-wing government. So, we'll come back to this at the end, because there's other examples of this happening. And before I do that, I want to talk about housing associations. Now, housing associations, those of us that think things should be paid for out of taxes and should be ours as of right, tend to have a bit of a problem with charity. Nobody likes to be the charity case. But housing associations kind of begin, essentially, kind of are legally charities. The housing association as an institution kind of arises in the 19th century, basically as, in many cases, and this isn't supposed to sound cynical, as a way of sort of bankers solving their consciences. That the Peabody Trust is sort of set up essentially by sort of guilty London bankers to build decent housing for the kind of deserving poor in the East End. And following the Peabody Trust, there's the Guinness Trust and various others. And they usually have some sort of large capital in there that then kind of guiltily creates a charity and sets it up and kind of rehouses people accordingly. There are interesting contrasts in London where you can find kind of early housing association estates right next to council estates. In Bloomsbury, God, I can't remember the street, quite near to Russell Square Station, you can see one of very, very early council estate, a London County Council estate, opposite a Peabody Trust estate from about 10 years earlier. And the contrast is very interesting. Both of them are kind of basically 5-story blocks of tenements. But the Peabody Trust one has this kind of slight sense of kind of some sufferance about it. It's kind of, it has a sort of vaguely kind of barrack-looking appearance. And kind of like, you'll live in this, but by God, you're not going to enjoy it. And then opposite, despite being quite similar in typology, the later London County Council estate has much nicer materials, and much more kind of nice details, a certain kind of sweetness about it, and it's much more kind of the sense that it's being done, with people rather than at them. But housing associations have a kind of reappear in the 1970s for quite different reasons. Although they're again kind of charitable bodies, they kind of reappear as an alternative to what were considered the mistakes of kind of top-down statist housing in the 1960s. So rather than having a kind of gigantic bureaucracy like the late lamented Greater London Council, managing housing, you would have these quite small little mobile bodies, which would be in theory much more open to control by the people that lived there. And most housing associations have representatives on their boards. So there's the idea was that this would be actually more democratic. And would avoid this kind of sense of kind of monolithicness. And most housing association schemes, were very much on a small scale. And the first really big ones in London. I mean, there've been kind of incremental stuff in the 70s, but the one that was really about kind of like creating an entirely new space was probably Coin Street in just in around Waterloo, basically, around the back of the National Theatre, around the back of the Oxo Tower. Now, originally, this is a heartwarming story of David versus Goliath. It really is. The site, a sort of former industrial site, very, very close to various prestigious bits of London. Although you should note that this is happening at a point when London's population was declining still. It wouldn't start rising again until the 1990s. This post-industrial site, originally, the developers want to build something massive and fancy by Richard Rogers. And Richard Rogers' plan for the scheme is fiercely opposed by Ken Livingstone, then the leader of the Greater London Council and one most famous representative of what the tabloids then called the loony left. Not quite so loony left later on, alas. So you have this kind of pitched battle essentially between the local community, people that live in this part of Lambeth, saying we do not want, a luxury office housing complex, on our doorstep. We want housing because we need it. We don't have much of it. There's a shortage. We need social housing here. Oh, bloody hell. All right, I'm going to have to go a lot quicker. So, to cut a long story short, they win, they build this, and they all live happily ever after. Coin Street kind of starts off being very, very suburban. It kind of sits very weirdly in this kind of very, very highly urban part of Lambeth. As the time goes on, it starts to look a bit less like Basingstoke, and it starts to get a bit better and look like this. They take over the Oxo Tower itself, this kind of building here with the Oxo logo, and kind of build housing in that as well. They have some kind of fairly twee restaurants. And, it becomes a sort of strange the social enclave in what otherwise is a kind of very, very touristic space. You've got National Theatre on one end, you've got the Globe Theatre built very soon after this on the other end. But in here you have very, very low income housing. People paying rent to live here are paying less than I am paying to live in Woolwich. And obviously I'm not happy about that. This in many ways seems kind of unalloyed goods, that this is social housing. But the thing with housing associations is that as well as building social housing, which goes to people on the council waiting list, they also build various other kinds of housing. They may build affordable housing, which currently means 80% of market rent, i.e. not affordable, or they may just build straightforward private housing. And Coin Street got into lots of trouble a few years ago for wanting to build a sort of skyscraper of luxury flats behind the National Theatre. And then in theory they would take the money from that and projects like that and spend that on building more social housing, perhaps. So although the fact that they're charities and they're not profit making, they are deeply involved in property development. And the later schemes that I will talk about are great examples of this. But there's one more thing I want to say about Coin Street and its ilk, is that while council housing is very much a kind of universal project, in both good and bad ways, depending on your opinion, this stuff often has a kind of elective element to it. So, to get one of the cooperative flats in Coin Street, and a friend of mine has one, so this is how I know this, you essentially are vetted. You are carefully vetted. It is made sure that you will be, a good member of the cooperative. Which you could argue is why these places work very well as communities and so forth. Or you could argue it's why they don't. That what they actually do is create sort of groups of people like us, rather than being universal provision for people that just need housing, as we all do. Anyway, moving on to Hume. This is Hume in Manchester. Hume, another area completely redeveloped by councils in the 1960s and 1970s, replaced with gigantic kind of brutalist blocks that were supposed to evoke the presence of Bath, which by all accounts didn't. Initially, it was rented to families who very, very quickly found they really didn't like it. And as at that point, Manchester City Council had lots and lots of housing. They just moved people out of it. They just moved people from their suburban houses in Burnage and Wythenshawe, and everybody was very happy. The disused crescents themselves very, very quickly became kind of home to a population of students, punks, squatters, crusties, smackheads, alternative types, who were either paying nominal rents or not paying rents at all. Liz Naylor, the kind of, sort of Factory Records kind of associate who wrote her masters on this later on, described it as nobody was paying rent, not even the rent boys. So, in many ways quite dysfunctional, but also very, very sort of, again to use a contemporary word that I'd rather not use, vibrant. Lots of the kind of Manchester club culture of the 80s and 90s came from Hume Crescents, right? I mean, this is one thing that anyone you speak to in Manchester will tell you, that it came from this, this planning disaster created a Manchester music culture that now sells itself on, which is worth remembering. The area was kind of completely demolished in the late 1990s, replaced with mostly housing association-owned kind of traditional housing on normal street plans and so forth. This bit was interesting because here, the kind of most activist bit of the Hume Crescents, the kind of hardcore crusties basically, the kind of hardcore anarcho contingent, managed to get rehoused by the Guinness Trust in something that they had a significant influence in designing. And interestingly, many of the things they asked for were things that were actually in the kind of brutalist Hume Crescents. Partly as a work-life space. Work-life space is, if we insist on, I keep coming up with words that I hate to use. That as well as being flats, there's workplaces as part of this for the people that live here. So it's kind of not just housing. As the Crescents have not become not just housing. Like famously, lots of the flats are being used as nightclubs and so forth. The deck access that had originally been, considered the reason why there was such crime in Hume and so forth, was retained. They kept the walkways that connected everything. They kept the very, very big public space in the middle that supposedly, again, was going to lead to grannies being raped and so forth. That all of this sort of stuff that was to demonise that original stuff, they all requested. And again, it seems to sort of work very, very well. Although there's been constant fight between the kind of anarchos there and the Guinness Trust who actually own it, and that they do not have ownership over it. So there's often been a lot of tension between them because of that. And also, like Coin Street, it's very, very elective. It's not easy to get a flat there. When you get a flat there, it'll be very nice and very cheap. But it's very much judged on whether you be a good community member or not. Certain aspects of this then kind of carry on into the much more full-on regeneration that takes over Manchester in the 2000s. This is an area formerly the Cardram estate in Ancoats that was rebranded by the property developers Urban Splash as New Islington, optimistically. It was voted by the residents, yeah. But nonetheless, it has a certain symbolic aspect.
It's an unofficial name for the area.
Yeah, I know, but there's a reason why people are choosing this. Why would you go back to that particular name? So in New Islington, you had this. I remember when I first went there about 3 or 4 years ago. One of the things that I found interesting about it was that this part of it, designed by the architects Fat, had been kind of reproduced in magazine after magazine and newspaper after newspaper as an example of a wonderful success. And counted on its own terms, it was. The Cardram estate was an area of kind of 70s housing, very, very low rise, quite kind of introverted, kind of, what happens to public housing after modernism, basically. It went very, very kind of like reduced versions of 19th century houses in cul-de-sacs, basically. The people that wanted to stay here were rehoused and kind of basically this kind of 2 streets of an alleyway in between. Again, one of those things where if you could have judged it from the magazines, you would assume that it was an entire estate rather than 2 streets, which is what it was. And, again, within its very, very small scale, it was a very, very interesting project, that the architects had worked very, very closely with the residents. They had, and again, not in the kind of box-ticking way, they had, went and spoke to everybody over a prolonged period of time, and kind of designed accordingly, actually. Lots of the aspects of the design that kind of look sort of perhaps excessively jokey actually kind of come from this process. But it's sort of the public bit, or the kind of public filling, in a sort of gigantic sort of sandwich of failed gentrification. That around it you have this kind of huge swathe of mostly derelict land, kind of dotted with, kind of large blocks for private rent, which were in a state of some considerable dereliction. So, again, you had this part where a housing association had kind of funded and taken over a small part of council housing, rebuilt it, and so forth, as part of a much, much wider scheme of sort of trying to extend the gentrification of Manchester from outside of the ring road into the area immediately around. One which, incidentally, in this particular case, failed. In London, something like this would be a ridiculously easy sell, and it would have swept across quite efficiently. And here it didn't. Here, most of this is still derelict. Park Hill and Sheffield, I don't have much time, and I've talked about this 1,000 times, and I get unconscionably angry about it, so I won't. But a fairly similar process: property developer, housing association, and so forth. You know, a kind of council estate basically being subject to design-led regeneration, meaning that one chunk of it gets turned into private flats, a huge chunk of it is derelict, and a small part of it was left as council and later to be housing association housing. This in a city, incidentally, which has tens of thousands of people on the council waiting list. And this, again, is one of the things that we should not forget about any of this. That this is a public asset that's desperately needed, that's being sold off. The thing I wanted to finish with was something, probably the most pessimistic and optimistic thing that I've come across in the UK, in terms of these kind of redevelopment schemes. And interestingly, it's one that involves arts funding rather than housing association funding. This is Anfield in Liverpool, very, very near to the Anfield football ground. And it's an area that was subject to a thing called Pathfinder that was rolled out across England from sort of, you know, from Birmingham to Sunderland, kind of northwards. That was, again, initially predicated on consultation, interestingly. That, you know, that people go there, and, you know, the person that one of the people that I spoke to there who still lives there, so described it as, you know, when the Pathfinder people came, they were the first people to want to speak to us in about 15 years. After they finished speaking to them, it turned out that what they wanted to do was demolish, you know, most of the area and replace it with alternately private housing to be sold to create a better social mix. We all know what that means. And also there was a certain amount of stuff being built by housing associations. In fact, mainly it was being built by housing associations, either for social rent, affordable, or in many cases private. This was then kind of bankrolled by large quantities of public money. But this all kind of ran out a few years ago. And it was this area, like many others, was kind of trapped halfway through. There's sort of small bits of incredibly ugly, uninspired housing association architecture, and lots of Victorian terraces that, if they were anywhere else, and certainly if they were in London, would go for huge quantities of money being cleared. And you know, here you can see just you walk around Anfield, and similarly walk around parts of Dingle and other parts of, you know, kind of inner city Liverpool, and you just see street after street after street of clearly high quality housing, tinned up. Now, the project that interested me was by Jan van Heeswijk, who was being mentioned earlier on. And I had projects and they basically involved, to cut a very, very long story short, so it involved basically taking a bakery in the heart of Anfield, a disused bakery in the heart of Anfield, getting it to, you know, getting it baking bread again, because this is most of the kind of the shopping units and pubs and so on, mostly derelict. Weirdly, given around the corner from Anfield Football Stadium, so you know, tens, hundreds of thousands of people walk past this every week. So you would think it would generate quite a lot of footfall, but this was not taken into account. So, you know, getting this bakery back into use, and then she started to try and, you know, setting up a group called Home Baked who would run it, then kind of taking bits of the street and running them as community land trusts. So this was basically as completely as arts funding. This was about the Liverpool Biennale. So this was, you know, by the only way that you could do a kind of social project to salvage the complete disaster that had happened here was via art. And she was very, very kind of, you know, honest about the fact that this wasn't really about making an artwork. That almost this was a you know, almost a kind of pretext for this social project. That you would sort of take this money from there and plough it into this, and you know, that looking at it and going, "Where's the art?" was completely missing the point. This wasn't really art. That this was kind of using art as an alibi to do something. And it was probably the only example I saw of something good that wasn't coming in train with something malevolent. That this wasn't happening as part of a wider, you know, destruction of the area. It was trying to stop the destruction of the area and trying to claw back parts of it. And if we see, and I do, as Alberta did this, as the process of class war, this is a very, very rare example of sort of successful defence. And it was very surreal for me to find that this was coming from, coming from arts money. Because, we're very familiar with this kind of process of artists being the, the advanced guard of gentrification, and rightly so. So I sort of want to leave it on that note, really. The fact that in very, very rare cases, and they are very rare, that the artists were actually able to do more good than expressly social charitable institutions like housing associations. And I never thought I'd find myself saying that, actually, that artists could do something. But there you go. I'll finish there. Cheers.